Frost clung to every post. A lone rider crossed the cold valley toward the old ranch. The barn roof had fallen in over the summer. He pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard. Breath fogged the air. His fingers brushed the folded paper inside his coat. He had come ready to speak, but high on the roof frame, a giant woman worked alone. She stood 11 feet tall if she stood an inch, lifting beams that should have needed 4 men. She set each one and drove the nails without looking down once. The wind sharpened. Hammer strikes rang out clear and hard. Somewhere in the distance, the town muttered low voices, already shaping stories about what they could not yet see. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Cassius Colton rode out to the old Vance place on a morning so cold it hurt to breathe. Frost on the fence posts. Frost on his mustache. He didn't notice either one. He was thinking about what he'd say. Rehearsing it. The way a man rehearses bad news he's decided. Actually good news. If you look at it right, a ranch takes people apart. It does it slow. It does it polite. And then one day there's nothing left of the person who arrived, and everybody stands around the grave saying how nobody could have known. Cassius knew. He'd watched it happen once already. He was not going to watch it happen twice. So he came prepared. He came with his hat brushed, and his voice steady, and a fair price for the land already worked out in his head. $1 for $1. Generous even, because a man could afford to be generous when he was doing the right thing. He came expecting to find a woman packing. He found something else entirely. The barn roof at the Vance place had come down over last summer. Whole section of it. Beams and shingles heaped up against the north wall, like a bad tooth knocked clean out of a jaw. Cassius had seen it from his own land for weeks, meant to ride over, meant to offer help the way you offer help to somebody who plainly cannot do the work themselves. Except when he came around the last bend in the trail, the roof wasn't a ruin anymore. It was half rebuilt, and standing up on the frame, setting a beam into place, with both hands like it weighed nothing, because to her, it didn't was Magnolia Vance. She was not what Cassius had pictured. Nobody's picture could have held her. She stood 11 feet if she stood an inch, shoulders like a door frame, hands that could palm a hay bale the way another woman might palm an apple. She'd rolled her sleeves up past the elbow, despite the cold, and her forearms were doing work that should have needed 4 men and a block and tackle. She set the beam. She nailed it. She didn't look down. Cassius sat his horse at the edge of the yard for a long moment, just watching, because his whole speech, the one he'd built so carefully on the ride over, had been built for a different woman entirely, a small woman, a soft woman, a woman who needed saving. This woman was not that, but that wasn't the point, was it? He caught himself right there. That was never the point, Cassius. Say it plain. Say it to yourself if nobody else. The land doesn't care how strong your arms are. The land isn't what breaks people out here. He swallowed that thought down and rode into the yard anyway. Miss Vance, she turned. Up on the beam, she had to look down to find him, and there was something almost funny about that. A woman looking down at a man on horseback like he was a child asking permission to speak. You'd be Colton. Her voice came easy, low, not unfriendly. My uncle wrote about you, said you were the only neighbor worth the name. Your uncle was kind, Hollickley. My uncle, Nolia said, was almost never kind. He was honest. There's a difference, and I mean to hold you to whichever one he actually meant. Cassius almost smiled.
Almost. He caught that too, and put it away, because smiling wasn't part of the plan. I came to talk,
He said, talking's free. Climb down off that horse and say it. So he did. He swung down, boots crunching frost, and stood at the base of the barn looking up at a woman built like she'd been carved out of the same mountains that framed the valley behind her. And he said the thing he'd rehearsed. Except it didn't come out the way he'd practiced. Miss Vance, I'll be plain because plain's a kindness out here. I didn't come to talk about the roof. I didn't come to talk about whether you can swing a hammer. Anybody with eyes can see you don't need help with that. She waited, didn't fill the silence for him. He respected that, even as it made the next part harder. I came to talk about the town. Something shifted in her face. Small, door closing partway, not all the way, just enough that he saw it happen. What about the town, then? They're not going to make this easy on you. Nothing's ever been easy on me, Mr. Colton. Not like this. He heard his own voice go rough, and he didn't like it, and he pushed through anyway. You're going to walk into that town for supplies, and every eye in the place is going to land on you, like you're a carnival act come through on a wagon. They're going to whisper, so some of them are going to stare outright, like it's their right. And it won't matter how many barns you rebuild alone, or how many fences you set straighter than any man in the county. Won't matter one bit. Because this isn't about what you can do, then what is it about? It's about what you are. The words hung in there in the cold air, and Cassius heard them the second they left him. And shame crawled hot up the back of his neck. Because that wasn't what he meant. Except it was exactly what he meant, and there was no clean way to say a cruel true thing without it landing cruel. Magnolia Vance did not flinch. That was the part that unsettled him most. She climbed down off the beam one long, easy drop that would have broken an ordinary person's ankles, and she simply bent her knees and absorbed it like stepping off a porch. And she walked up close enough that he had to tip his head back to hold her eye. Mr. Colton, her voice hadn't changed. Still even, still low. I have spent every year of my life being told what I am, by people who never once bothered to ask. I have stood in a tent with the barker outside calling me the eighth wonder of creation. Come one, come all. 25 cents to see the giant woman. Don't get too close now, folks. Don't want anybody hurt. I have had grown bring their children up close to poke my arm like I was livestock at a fair. I know what I am to people who've never spoken 10 words to me. She let that sit. Let him feel the weight of it. So you'll forgive me, she said. If a little small-town whispering doesn't frighten me half so much as you seem to think it should. Cassius stood there, and for a second, just a second, his careful speech, the fair price, the generous offer, the whole tidy plan, all of it went thin as smoke, because he hadn't come here to insult her. He'd come here to spare her something, and now he was standing in front of a woman who had already survived worse than anything this valley could throw at her. Hurt, telling her she couldn't survive it. That's not the plan going sideways, a voice in him said. That's the plan being wrong from the start. He shoved the voice down. It's not the same, he said. A fair, a crowd that pays a quarter and moves on. This is different. This is people you'll see every week for the rest of your life. People who decide once who you are and never let you be anything else after. You talk like you've watched that happen. The question landed square in his chest like at a dropped beam. I have, he said. And then, before he could stop himself, before the sensible, careful part of him could grab the reins, I watched it kill somebody. Silence. Cold wind moving through frost-stiff grass. Magnolia watched him, waited. And Cassius felt the words rising in his throat like something climbing out of a well. Something that had been down there 11 years, patient, waiting for exactly this kind of cold morning to come back up into the light, and he swallowed it. Forget I said that. I won't, Miss Vance. I said I won't forget it, Mr. Colton. I didn't say I'd push. She turned back to the barn, picked up her hammer. And that was the end of it for that morning. Cassius Colton rode home with his fair price, still folded in his coat pocket, unspoken, and a feeling in his chest like a door he'd opened by accident and couldn't quite get shut again. Let me tell you why. Magnolia Vance came to Wyoming because it matters, and because it is not the story anybody in that town would have guessed. She was 28 years old. She had been 11 feet tall since she was 17 before that. Tall for her age was unremarkable. Ducked through doorway and little else. And then something in her had simply kept growing, past what doctors could explain, past what her own family could look at without flinching, until by 19 she stood taller than any man in 3 counties, and her parents, quiet, respectable people who loved her the best they knew how, had run entirely out of ideas for what to do with a daughter built like that. A man came through their town with a traveling show. He had gentle words for her parents and better words for Magnolia. Herself words about opportunity, about seeing the world, about a life where her size wasn't a burden but a wage. Her parents, God rest the ones who are gone and forgive the ones who aren't, said yes. She was 19 when she stepped into that tent for the first time. She was 28 when she walked out of the last one. 9 years of a barker's voice announcing her like weather. 9 years of strangers' eyes running up and down her the way you'd size up a horse at auction. She had been asked to lift wagon wheels over her head for applause. She had been asked to let children touch her hands so their parents could tell the story later at supper. She had smiled through every bit of it, because smiling was in the contract, whether anybody wrote it down or not. The show moved through a dozen states in those 9 years, and Magnolia learned things about people she never asked to learn. She learned that kindness and curiosity could wear the exact same face, and that the only way to tell them apart was time, which the show never gave her. One town, one weekend, one wagon load of gawking, and gone before anybody had to reckon with her as a person instead of an attraction. She learned to read a crowd from the wings before the tent flap even opened. The particular pitch of a mean laugh against a nervous one, the children who came to stare and the ones who came, quietly, hoping to be told it was all right to be strange in this world too. And then her Uncle Silas, a Bosseton, a man she'd met exactly twice in her life, both times as a girl, both times, before the growing started, began writing to her. He wrote because he'd heard, through the long, slow gossip of family that never quite talks to each other, what she'd become. Not what she'd become in the growing sense. What she'd become in the tent. His first letter said, "I hear they're charging admission to look at you. I want you to know that makes me sick, and I want you to know there is a piece of land out here that doesn't care what size a person is, only whether they can work it." She hadn't answered that letter for 4 months, because she didn't trust it, because kindness from strangers had always, in her experience, come with a barker's voice attached somewhere underneath. But Silas kept writing. Long letters by Colin Creek water, and the particular way October light came down over the ridge behind his house. He never once asked her to perform anything. He never once mentioned her size except that first time, and after that, not again, as if he'd said the necessary thing and considered the matter closed. Some of his letters were almost funny in a dry, weathered way. He wrote about a mule that had learned to open gate latches, house with its teeth out of pure spite. He wrote about a winter so cold the creek froze solid enough to walk a wagon across, and how a fool named Tobias tried it anyway, and had to be fished out indignant and soaked, by 3 neighbors laughing too hard to be much use. He never asked for her anything in return except that she write back like, and, no sooner, she started writing back around the 5th month. Small things at first, a description of a town square, a joke about the barker's terrible singing voice, then longer things, then, eventually, true things. Silas never once flinched at any of it in his replies, and slowly, over 3 years of letters, Magnolia Vance, and that this uncle she barely remembered had built, patiently, out of nothing but paper and ink, the first relationship of her adult life that did not require her to be looked at. When he died this past spring, he left her the ranch, 400 acres of Wyoming grass, a house, a barn with a bad roof, and a letter that arrived 2 weeks after the lawyer's telegram, because Silas, practical man that he was, had written it and dated it and left it with instructions to send it only after he was gone. The letter said, "I never got to tell you in person that you were the only relative I had who I thought might actually be strong enough for this place. I don't mean your arms, though Lord knows. I mean the rest of you. Come see if I was right." So she came. She sold nothing of her old life because there was nothing in it worth keeping a trunk of clothes. A name that had been printed on 100 handbills she never wanted printed again, and she stepped off the train in a town that had never seen anything like her and never would again, and she walked the 6 miles to the ranch because no wagon in the livery would hold her comfortably. And she did not cry once on that walk, though she thought, more than once, that she might. She had come west to stop being a spectacle. She had not expected the first man she met out here to look at her the way the barker used to. Not with wonder, with warning. But there was something different underneath Cassius Colton's warning, and she'd felt it even in that first conversation, the way you feel weather changing before the sky admits it. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid for her. Those were different things entirely. And Magnolia, who had spent 9 years learning to read a crowd the way other people read weather, had felt the difference immediately, even if she hadn't yet caught the reason underneath it. Now let me tell you about Cassius Colton, and why a man who seemed decent enough at the wood pile could stand there and say something so plainly wrong to a woman he'd known for 10 minutes.
Yes.
He was 45 years old. He had married at 30. A woman he loved with a particular, desperate gratitude of a man who'd never expected anyone to choose him. And for 4 years he had watched that marriage come apart in ways so slow he couldn't point to the day it broke, only the years it took. Her name does not matter yet. Hold on to that. There will be a right time for her name, and this is not it. What matters is this: she had not been born to this land, and this land had not been kind to her. And here is the part Cassius could never say out loud. Not once in 11 years the land had not been the only thing unkind to her. The town had its opinions. Small towns always do. A woman who didn't take to canning the way the other ranch wives did. A woman who read books instead of visiting. A woman who cried, sometimes in the church pew, for reasons nobody bothered to ask about, because asking felt like an intrusion nobody wanted to make. The whispers started slow and grew the way whispers do, until she was, in the town's quiet, unspoken vocabulary, a woman who didn't quite fit. Cassius remembered small things he wished he didn't. A church supper where 3 women had gone silent when she approached, then resumed talking a beat too fast about a subject that had not been the subject a moment before. An afternoon at the Mercantile, when the shopkeeper's wife had made a comment about girls who weren't raised to ranch life loud enough to carry, and Cassius had stood 3 feet away, counting out coins for nails, and said nothing. And Cassius Young walked proud, certain that a man's job was to provide a proof of water, and nothing further, had never once stood up in that church, in that store, in that circle of gossiping wives' homes, and said, "Leave her be. She is mine and I love her, and none of you have the right to decide what she is." He told himself for years that silence was neutral, that not joining in the whispering was the same as defending her. It was not the same. He knew that now. He had known it, if he was honest, for 11 years, ever since the morning she packed a single trunk and told him, with a gentleness that somehow made it worse, that she could not live one more year being tolerated by people her own husband wouldn't correct. She left. 3 years later, a telegram came from a town 2 states east, informing him she had died of a fever, alone, in a boarding house, with no family present because she had none left, who claimed her and a husband too proud and too late to have gone after her. Cassius Colton had built out of that 11-year wound one single unbending belief: the land does not forgive difference. And a man who loves someone different owes her more than silence, owes her a voice raised loud enough to drown out every whisper in the county. If he does not raise that voice, the difference will not be what kills her. His silence will. He had never told anyone this. He had certainly never intended to tell Magnolia Vance, a woman he'd met one time at a woodpile on a cold October morning. But something about watching her stand there, unbroken, unbothered, entirely herself, in a way his wife had never once managed to be, out here, in this same cold valley, had cracked something loose in him that he'd kept sealed for over a decade. That was the thing Magnolia did not yet know. She heard a man tell her the town would reject her, and she took it, fairly enough, as a man underestimating what she'd already survived. She did not know she was standing in the shadow of a woman whose name he hadn't spoken in years. She did not know that every warning Cassius Colton aimed at her was really a confession he hadn't found the nerve to finish. And so the 2 of them began that autumn on uneven ground, each one reading the other wrong, and people do when the real story is buried too deep to see from the surface. Cassius kept the promise he'd made to Silas, which many kept writing over, telling himself each time that This visit, surely this one would be the one where he found her ready to admit the town had worn her down. Instead, week after week, Magnolia Vance simply did not wear down. The roof got finished. Not in a week, not in two, but by the time the first real cold set in, the Vance barn stood whole again, tighter than it had been in Silas's last years of managing it alone. Cassius rode by one afternoon meaning to look in on the work, and found Magnolia up on the ridge line, setting the final shingles by herself, whistling something tuneless and satisfied. And he sat his horse at the fence and did not announce himself for a full minute, just swing, feeling something he refused to name. Then there was the well. The old well pump had seized up sometime over the summer, rusted through at the tent, and any rancher in the valley would have told you it needed 2 men and a length of chain to pull the housing and reset it. Cassius rode over one morning, fully intending to offer his back for the job, the way you offer a thing to somebody who can't manage it alone. He found Magnolia had already pulled the housing by hand. She stood there with rust staining her forearms to the elbow, fitting the new joint her uncle had left stockpiled in the barn. And when she saw Cassius's face, she laughed, an actual laugh, warm and unbothered, and said, "You can shut your mouth now, Mr. Colton. You'll catch flies. I came to help with that. You came to confirm I'd have failed at it, which I understand, which I've stopped minding, mostly. But you're welcome to hold the wrench while I explain to you what you were about to do wrong." He held the wrench. He rode home, unsettled. There was the cattle, to a stretch of fence gone down over a rocky draw that no ranch wife in the valley, in Cassius' experience, had ever tackled alone, because setting posts in that ground meant fighting rock with a bar for half a day per hole. Cassius came by expecting, again, to find her stuck. He found her 3 posts deep into the line, sweat cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face, despite the cold, moving rock with her bare hands that would have needed dynamite for an ordinary man. "Tamp it in layers," she said without looking up, before he'd said a word. "Not all at once. Heaves in the spring if you pack it wrong. That's exactly right. I know it's exactly right. My uncle wrote me a letter about fence posts once. Man wrote me a letter about everything. I could build you a whole ranch but Silas Vance's correspondence." And here is the thing Cassius Colton began to notice. Somewhere in the slow accumulating middle of all this being proved wrong, he began to notice that his visits had stopped needing an excuse. The barn was fixed. The well was fixed. The fence line, post by stubborn post, was fixed. Silas's promise did not require a man to ride 6 miles every 3rd day, checking on work that plainly did not need checking. But Cassius kept finding reasons, and the reasons were getting thinner, and he was not being honest with himself about why, because being honest about why meant admitting something he was not remotely ready to admit, because Magnolia Vance was not what he had believed a stranger to this land had to be. She was not soft. She had never been soft, not once, not for one single day since she stepped off that train. She was capable in a way that unsettled him, precisely because it had nothing to do with her size. Any fool could see an 11-foot woman could lift what a normal man couldn't. What unsettled him was the rest of it. The stubbornness. The dry humor that came out sideways when you weren't braced for it. The way she asked him questions about the land, real questions, the kind that meant she intended to understand bodies down to its bones, not just survive it. And then actually listens to turning them over, testing them against what her uncle had written her, filing away what was useful and discarding gently what wasn't. And she was slowly, unmistakably, falling in love with a piece of ground that Cassius had spent 11 years believing could only take from a person who didn't belong to it. That was the part he could not get past. He had watched one woman wither here. He was watching this one bloom. Same wind, same brutal winters coming, same endless grinding work. And where the first had shrunk a little more every season, Magnolia seemed to be growing into the shape of the place, as if the hardness of it were feeding something in her, rather than how wearing it away, he'd then wearing it away. He did not understand it, and frightened him in a way he hadn't expected, because it meant His 11-year certainty, the whole architecture of guilt and grief he hid sleep around, had a crack running through it now, right at the foundation. And a man does not enjoy discovering, at 45, that the truth he's organized his whole heart around might not be the whole truth after all. Magnolia, for her part, had begun revising her first read on Cassius Colton. The way a person does over a season of small observations, she had thought him arrogant that first morning. A man who looked at a woman he'd never spoken to and decided, before she'd swung a single hammer, what she was and wasn't capable of. That reading did not entirely hold up. The more time passed, because the wood that was too heavy for her to haul alone. In one trip there wasn't such wood. Not really, not for her. But there was a night, the well-piped night, needed replacing, and she'd been at it past dark, exhausted, and had gone to bed, meaning to finish the morning. Pirtwid finished in the morning. Somebody had ridden over in the dark and set the last section himself, and left before she woke. And when she asked him about it later, he only shrugged and said the moon had been good for riding, because the gate on the south pasture, the one that had been hanging crooked and catching on itself for weeks, one morning simply wasn't crooked anymore. Rehung, level the hinge ailed, because for a man who had told her, to her face, that she did not belong here, Cassius Colton spent an enormous amount of time making sure she never had to struggle with a single thing longer than one night, which told her something underneath his gruffness that his words hadn't, which she noticed and set aside and did not press. Because Magnolia Vance had learned, in 9 years under a tent, exactly how long to wait before reaching for a person's real story. You did not grab it. You let it come up on its own schedule, or it came up wrong, half-formed, defensive, useless, so she waited. There was an evening, late that autumn, the light going thin and gold, the way it does right before the real cold sets in for good, when Cassius stayed later at the ranch than he had any reason to. They'd been working out a plan for wintering her small herd where to shelter them. How much hay Silas had actually left stockpiled versus how much the ledger claimed. And by the time the plan was settled, it was near dark, and Magnolia, without either of them remarking on it, set 2 places at the table. Habit forms before you notice it's forming. This was one of those, over supper beans and cornbread and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Because Magnolia Vance had apparently never in her life made a weak pot of anything she asked him the question she'd been sitting on for weeks. Mr. Colton, Cassius, you've fixed my well. Feels foolish standing on Mr. Cassius. Then she turned her cup slowly on the table, not looking at him yet. Why were you so sure I'd fail that first morning? You didn't know me. Looked at me one time and decided the whole thing. Before I'd said 10 words, silence. The stove ticking as it cooled. I told you, he said. It's not about, I know what you told me. What? What's your what? Not who. I heard it the first time and I've heard it every day of my life in one version or another. I'm asking you something different. I'm asking why it scared you so bad. Because that's what it was. Wasn't caution. Was fear. Cassius set his fork down. And here, right here, the 11-year-old thing climbed halfway up the well again. I knew a woman once. His voice came out rougher than he meant it. Magnolia went very still. The particular stillness of someone who understands they are about to be told something and does not want to spook it back down. She came out here, Cassius said, from somewhere else. Somewhere with paved streets, and the land was hard on her. Harder than it should have been, maybe just as hard as it is on anybody. I don't rightly know anymore, but I watched it happen. I watched somebody shrink down to nothing right in front of me, one season at a time, and I, stop right there, Cassius. He heard himself say too much, and he heard, right behind it, every year of silence rising up to grab the reins back, the way it always had, the way it had at every church supper, every gossiping circle of wives for 4 straight years. The same old cowardice, wearing its same old face. Telling him now was not the time. This was not the woman. Some things were better left where he'd buried them. I didn't want to watch that happen again. That was as far as it went. He looked down at his plate. Magnolia watched him for a long moment. And she was wise enough. She had spent 9 years reading exactly this kind of silence off 100 different faces, not Tutford on the rest of it, before he was ready to hand it over himself. Well, she said finally. Gently, I'm not her. Whoever she was. No, Cassius said. His voice had gone quiet in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. No, you surely are not. I hope you're starting to see that. I'm starting to. A pause. I've been starting to for a while now, if I'm honest with you. That was as far as the evening went. But it was a good deal further than it had ever gone before, and both of them knew it. Sitting there in the low stove light, with the whole cold valley gone now dark outside the windows, Cassius rode home that night, turning something over that he could not quite name, because for 11 years he had told himself one true thing, over and over, the way you tell yourself a thing so it stays fixed and doesn't have to be looked at directly. The land breaks people who don't belong to it. He had built his whole life since her leaving around that one sentence. And now here was a woman the land seemed to be feeding instead of starving. And every week that passed made his old certainty look less like wisdom and more like something he'd built to keep from ever having to ask himself the harder question. What if it was never the land at all? What if it was only ever silence? His silence. A husband too proud to stand up at her church to say leave her be, and a valley that had never once needed to break her. Not really, not without his help. He did not let that thought all the way in. Not yet. It was too big and too late at night, and 11 years of scar tissue does not tear open in one sitting. But something had cracked. He could feel it, the way you feel a fence post give a half-inch before it finally goes. Down at the store 2 days later, buying nails he did not strictly need, Cassius ran into Cornelius Garrity, who owned considerably more land than any one man needed and always seemed to know, with unsettling precision, exactly which parcels might soon be willing to sell. Colton. Garrity's voice had the smooth, unhurried quality of a man who never raved just because he never had to. Here the Vance place has got itself a new owner. Big woman, they're saying. Real big. She's settling in fine. Water rights on that section always did sit close to mine. Garrity smiled, and the smile did not reach anywhere near his eyes. Be a shame if somebody unfamiliar with the boundary lines got herself into difficulty out there, all alone. This time of year, Cassius felt something cold move down the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the weather. She's not alone, he said. Silas made sure of that before he passed. And so will I. Garrity's smile didn't change. But something behind his eyes filed the answer away, the careful way a man files away information he intends to use later. Course, Garrity said. Course she isn't. He tipped his hat and walked on. And Cassius stood there a moment longer than he meant to, nails forgotten in his hand, watching the man's back and not liking, for reasons he couldn't yet fully explain to himself, the shape of that smile. Garrity had built his ranch on borrowed money and other men's mistakes, buying up parcels from ranchers too tired or too broke to keep fighting the ground. And he had done it, for the most part, without ever once breaking the letter of the law, a fact he was privately proud of, the way a man is proud of a fence he built exactly to the property line and not 1 inch inside it. He did not consider himself a villain. He considered himself efficient. But that was a smaller worry, set against the larger one turning in Cassius now. He rode home past the Vance place without stops low, letting his horse pick its own pace, and he found himself doing something he had not let himself do in 11 years. He found himself thinking her name, not saying it. Not yet. He wasn't ready to say it out loud to another living soul, not even the horse under him. But he let the shape of it move through his mind. The first time in over a decade he'd let it come, without immediately shoving it back down into the well where he kept it. Because something about a giant woman rebuilding a barn roof alone, laughing at his caution, how setting 2 plates at a table was the most natural thing in the world, had cracked 11 years of careful silence right down the middle. And Cassius Colton did not yet know what he was going to do about that. Except he knew, riding home under a sky going the deep, hard blue of an early winter evening, that he was no longer riding out to the Vance place to keep a promise to a dead man. He was riding out there because a day he didn't see her had started to feel, in some small and unwelcome way, like a day gone wrong, and that frightened him more than anything Cornelius Garrity's smile had managed to. The frost had held for a week. Then it broke, the way it does out here, into one of those false warm days that fools a person into thinking winter forgot to come. Magnolia was mending the last stretch of south fence when she found the first wire cut clean through, not snapped at, not weathered. Cut as she stood there with the cold end of it in her hand, turning it over, and her jaw set slow and hard. Because a fence doesn't cut itself. Because wire doesn't fray in a straight line like that. Not from wind, not from cattle leaning on it, not from anything God puts out here on purpose. Somebody had done this. She followed the line 40 yards and found another cut. Then another. 3 breaks in a fence that had held fine all season and every one of them clean as a knife. She didn't say anything to Cassius. Not yet. She fixed the wire herself, twist and pull, and twist again. Hands raw in the cold, and she told herself it was nothing. Kids, maybe. Bored ranch hands with nothing better to do. Except kids don't cut fence in 3 places a half-mile apart and leave no tracks. Which was the first thing that should have frightened her. It wasn't the last. 3 days after that, the well went bad. She noticed it in the taste first. A metal bitterness under the cold. Something that didn't belong, and then she noticed the cattle wouldn't touch the trough, standing off from it in a stubborn half-circle, lowing low and unhappy the way animals do when they know something a person hasn't figured out yet. She hauled a bucket up and held it to the light, and there was a film on it. Thin, oily, wrong. Somebody poisoned my well, she said out loud, to nobody, because saying it to nobody was still better than not saying it at all. She rode into town that afternoon for the first time in 2 weeks, and this was the moment everything about the whispering Cassius warned her about stopped being a warning and started being real. Right there in the open air of the main street, in broad daylight, in front of God and everybody. Because the second she came around the mercantile corner, a woman pulled her 2 children back against her skirts. It's like Magnolia carried something catching. Because a man loading feed sacks onto a wagon stopped loading them, just stood there, staring. The way you'd stare at weather coming in wrong over the mountains. Because somebody she never did find out who, and maybe that was worse said, saw not quiet enough, not quite at all really. That's the one poisoned her own stock trying to blame somebody else for it. Magnolia stopped in the street, turned, "I'm sorry." Nobody answered, which was its own kind of answer. "Say that again," she said. "I'd like to hear it plain, not muttered into somebody's collar, slints. The kind that has weight to it, the kind that presses." She rode home that afternoon with her jaw set so tight it ached, and it was not the staring that got under her skin, because Lord knew she'd survived 9 years of staring. Staring was nothing. Staring was the cheapest thing a crowd could give you. It was the accusation. Poisoned her own stock, somebody had said that, which meant somebody had put that story into the air on purpose, ahead of her arriving, planted it like a fence post, driven deep enough that it was already standing there waiting when she walked into town. She rode straight past her own turnoff, straight to the Colton place. Cassius Sikas was in the yard splitting. Kittlekin 20 feet up the driveway, fast enough that her horse was blowing hard, and he had the axe half raised and he saw her face and set it down without finishing the swing. "What happened? Somebody's been at my fence. Somebody's fouled my well. And now half the town thinks I did it myself." Her voice was steady. It cost her something to keep it steady, and he could see that cost sitting right there behind her eyes. "Tell me I'm imagining that, Cassius. Tell me that's not exactly what it sounds like." He didn't tell her that because he already knew what it sounded like. Because he'd stood in the mercantile 2 days back and heard Cornelius Garrity's name come up in a sentence about her water writer's post. Careless, almost friendly, the way a man drops a thing he wants picked up by somebody other than himself. "It's not imagining," Cassius said. "I think I know who." "Then say it, Garrity." Magnolia went very still. The landman, Cassius's jaw worked. "He's been sniffing around your water rights since before you got here." Told me himself, near enough, in the Mercantile. Said it'd be a shame if somebody unfamiliar with the boundaries got into difficulty out here alone. I should have come and told you the same day. I didn't. I'm telling you now. Why didn't you? The question landed simple and direct, the way she asked everything. And Cassius felt the old-fold familiar shame climb up his throat before he could stop it. Because that's what I do, some part of him said, cold and clear. I see trouble coming for a woman, and I keep it to myself, and I tell myself I'm protecting her by staying quiet. And every single time, Cassius, that quiet costs her something she didn't have to pay. I don't have a good answer for that, he said. I should have ridden straight here. I didn't. That's on me. Magnolia looked at him a long moment. Something passed behind her eyes, not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, but a kind of filing away, the same careful bookkeeping she did with everything. Weighing this against the well pipe fixed in the night, and the gate rehung level, and all the rest of it. Don't do that again, she said. I won't. I mean it, Cassius. I've had my whole life decided behind my back by people who thought they were sparing me something. I don't need sparing. I need told. I hear you. Say it back to me so I know you heard it. You need told. Not spared, he held her eyes. I hear you, Magnolia. It was the first time Itzela said her name to her face without the miss in front of it, and something small and unspoken passed between them in that moment. Cold yard, half-split kindling, both of them a little raw. Now let me tell you what Cornelius Garrity actually wanted, because it matters. And because a story needs its villain to want something plain and understandable, not just wickedness, for its own sake. Garrity did not hate Magnolia Vance. He barely thought about her at all, except as an obstacle, which in some ways was worse than hate. What Garrity wanted was water. The Vance land sat on the high side of a creek that fed 3 separate spreads downstream, including 200 acres of Garrity's own thin, overgrazed range that had been going drier every year, since he'd stripped it bare, chasing quick profit on too many cattle. Silas Vance had held the water rights on that creek fair and legal for 30 years, and had never once let Garrity buy so much as an acre of frontage, because Silas, practical, honest man that he was, had never trusted Garrity's smile any further than he could throw it. With Silas gone, Garrity had assumed the land would pass to some Boston relative who'd never seen Wyoming and would sell the whole parcel sight unseen at the first decent offer. Instead, it had gone to a woman built like a mountain who intended, plainly, to stay. Garrity was not a stupid man. He understood immediately that Magnolia Vance would not sell to threats, would not sell to a fair price, would not sell to anything so simple as being asked twice. So he did the only thing left to a man who wants land he can't buy honestly. He made her too much trouble to keep, cut fence, so her cattle drifted and cost her labor chasing them down, fouled well water, so illness in her herd could be blamed on her own inexperience. And underneath all of it, quiet, patient, the same slow poison poured into the town itself, a word here, a rumor there, planted weeks before her arrival even had a chance to prove itself wrong. Big, strange. Not natural. You wait. That one'll bring trouble on this whole valley. He did not need the whole town to hate her. He only needed enough of it uneasy that when the well went bad and tents came down, the town's first thought would be her fault, not his. It was, in its quiet way, exactly the same weapon Cassius Colton understood better than anyone alive. Silence, aimed with intent, could do more damage than any cut fence ever could. Magnolia found the proof 3 days later, and she found it because she stopped trusting the wind to explain things that didn't add up. She'd started riding her fence line at dawn now, every morning. Before the light was fully up, watching the ground the way her uncle's letters had taught her to watch it, for tracks, for sign, for anything that didn't belong. And on the 4th morning she found a boot print pressed clean into frost-softened mud, not 30 feet from the newest cut wire. Not her print. Not Cassius's, whose boots she'd have known by now, the way you know a familiar thing without thinking about it. A stranger's print, and beside it, half buried, a bottle. Small, glass. The kind a man might carry a foul tincture in. If a man wanted to foul a well without getting close enough to be seen doing it from the house. She wrapped both in a scrap of cloth and rode straight for the Colton place again, and this time Cassius was waiting on the porch before she'd even reined in, like he'd felt her coming. "Found something," she said, and held it out. He turned the bottle over in his hands, held it to the light, and his face went hard in a way she hadn't seen on him yet. "That's carbolic," he said. "Used for sheep dip, mostly. Man wanting to foul a well without killing anything permanent would use just about exactly this. Whose boot print, I don't know for certain." A pause. "But I know one of Garrity's hands wears a heel like that. Seen it in the mud outside the saloon more times than I care to count." "That's not proof." "No," Cassius said. "It's not. Not the kind a judge would look at twice. But it's enough for me to know I'm right, and it's enough that we don't sit here waiting for the next thing he tries." Magnolia looked at the bottle a long moment. "I didn't come us to fight a war over water rights," she said, quiet. "I came to have one thing that was mine. Now some man I've never spoken 10 words to wants to take that too. He won't. You can't promise me that?" "No," Cassius said. "I can't. But I can promise you this. You won't be standing alone in front of it. Whatever he tries next, that was as far as the morning went." But something had shifted between them again. Another half-inch post giving under weight. And both of them felt it, and neither said its name. It was 2 days later, at the Mercantile, that Magnolia learned the thing that changed everything. She'd gone in for flour and coffee, bracing herself the way she always braced now for the stairs. And she was at the counter when an older woman, gray-haired, small, sharp-eyed, in the manner of someone who has watched a town's whole history, passed through her front window, spoke up from behind a bolt of calico. "You're the one staying at the Vance place?" "I am. Working it alone?" "I am that too." The woman studied her a long moment, not unkindly. More the way you'd study a photograph, looking for a resemblance you weren't sure was really there. "Colton's been out to see you a fair bit, I hear." Magnolia felt something go careful in her chest. "He was a friend of my uncle's, The old woman set the calico down. "He was married once, you know. Colton, he's told me some of it. Has he told you her name?" Magnolia went still. "No, Winifred." The old woman said it soft, the way you say a name that's been sitting unused a long time. "Dusty, with disuse. Pretty thing. Came out from back east same as you did, though not so far and not so," she gestured, vaguely, not unkindly, at Magnolia's whole considerable frame, and let the sentence trail rather than finish it rudely. "Not so unusual, I mean. But this town wasn't kind to her all the same. Women can be cruel in ways that don't leave marks. She didn't can right, didn't visit right. Cried in church where anybody could see it, and nobody had the decency to ask why. What happened to her? She left him. 11 years back now, near enough. And I always thought," the old woman stopped herself, then decided, evidently, that Magnolia had earned the rest of it. "I always thought Cassius Colton stood by and let this whole town chip away at that woman for 4 solid years and never once told a soul to leave her be. Not once. And when she finally packed her trunk, I don't know that anybody in this town blamed him near as much as they should have. We blamed the land. Easier that way. Land can't defend itself and it can't argue back." Magnolia stood at that counter with her flour half wrapped and felt something rearrange itself entirely inside her chest. Because that explained the woodpile. That explained the fence line fixed in secret and the gate ring. In the dark, and every single time Cassius Colton had looked at her like he was watching it walk around in daylight. Because he was. Did she? Magnolia's voice how lower than she meant it to. "Is she still died 3 years after she left?" "Fever," they said, "in a boarding house 2 states over. No family by her when it happened." The old woman's face softened, just slightly. "I don't tell you this to speak ill of him. Understand. Man suffered plenty for it. These 11 years, whatever he has or hasn't earned of that suffering."
I tell you because you ought to know what shadow you're standing in, dear, before you decide whether you want to stand in it. Magnolia rode home that afternoon slower than she'd ever ridden it.
Turning the story over and over, fitting it against everything she already knew, the way you fit a puzzle piece against an image you can almost see the whole of. She thought of the woodpile that first morning. A ranch is no place for a city girl. Not because he thought her weak. Because he'd watched weakness get manufactured by silence, by the whole town's small daily cruelties, and he could not bear to watch it happen again. She thought of the well pipe fixed at midnight, the gate rehung before dawn, every single act of care he'd performed, and then hidden, like a man ashamed of being caught doing the one thing he hadn't managed to do for the wife he'd actually loved, and she thought, he has spent 11 years punishing himself with silence, and now he doesn't know how to stop. She found him that evening at his own place, sitting on the porch step in the last gray light. Not doing anything, just sitting, when he is doing his heavy to carry standing up. She didn't announce herself. She simply sat down on the step, considerably under her weight, and under any other circumstance it might have been funny, and neither of them laughed. "I know about Winifred," she said. Cassius went very still. "Who told you? Doesn't matter who told me. Matters that it's true." He didn't deny it. He sat there with his forearms braced on his knees, staring out at nothing, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual steadiness left in it. "What exactly did you hear? That she came from somewhere else? That this town wasn't kind to her? That she left, and 3 years later she died, alone, someplace far from here, with nobody by her? Magnolia paused, and that you never once stood up for her? Not in church, not in the store, not one single time in 4 years, silence, long enough that a bird somewhere in the dark called twice and gave up." "That's true," Cassius said finally. "Every word of it. Why? Because I was a coward." The word came out of him flat, unadorned, like something he'd practiced, saying alone in the dark, thousands times, never once said out loud to another living person. Because I told myself every single time that staying quiet was the same as protecting her. That if I didn't join the whispering, I wasn't part of it. And I believed that life for 4 straight years, while she sat in a church pew crying, and not one soul, including her own husband, asked her why. Why didn't you ask? Because asking meant admitting there was something to defend her against. And defending her meant standing up in front of men I'd known my whole life and telling them to shut their mouths about my wife. And I was proud. Magnolia. I was young and proud, and I thought a man's job started and ended at the fence line and the firewood, and anything past that was. His voice cracked, just slightly, just once, was somebody else's business to sort out on her own. So she sorted it out on her own. She packed a trunk and told me, gentle as anything, gentler than I deserved, that she couldn't spend 1 more year being tolerated by people her own husband wouldn't correct, and I let her go. I told myself the land had beaten her. I built that story so carefully, Magnolia. I built it so I wouldn't have to look at the real one, which is, Cassius turned and looked at her then, and his eyes were wet in the last of the light, and his voice, when it came, was rougher than she'd ever heard it. The land never touched her. Not really. Winter's hard on everybody out here, man or woman, don't care where you're born. What killed her, what actually wore that woman down to nothing, was 4 years of a town's small cruelty, and a husband too proud to stand between her and it. That's the truth I've spent 11 years hiding from myself behind a story about hard ground and cold winters. The ground didn't do it. He stopped, swallowed, made himself finish it. I did it. My silence did it. And when the telegram came saying she'd died alone in some boarding house 2 states away, with nobody there who loved her, I understood too late. The way a man always understands these things, too late that I hadn't lost her to Wyoming. I'd lost her to every single time I kept my I should have opened it. Magnolia sat with that a long moment. The dark had come down fully now, cold pressing in off the ridge, and somewhere out past the fence line a coyote called once and fell quiet. "That's why the woodpile," she said finally. "That first morning. That's why the woodpile. You weren't warning me about myself. You were warning me about you." Cassius let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except there was nothing funny in it at all, I suppose. I was, he said, telling you the land would break you, when what I meant, underneath it, was, I don't trust myself not to fail you the same way I failed her. Easier to blame the ground. Ground never talks back. Magnolia was quiet for a while. When she spoke again, her voice had gone gentler than he'd heard it yet. Gentle in a way that cost her something to offer, because gentleness had never come easy or free to one who'd spent 9 years being looked at instead of seen. I'm not going anywhere, Cassius. I know that now, and I'm not her. I need you to understand that, Plain. The way you like things, said Plain. I am not asking you to protect me from whispers. I have outlived worse than whispers. What I need, she stopped, chose the words with care, is for you to never again decide, on my behalf, what I can and can't stand to hear. She needed that from you and didn't get it. I am telling you now to your face, so there's no mistaking it later, whatever comes, whatever Garrity tries next. However this town looks at me, you tell me, all of it, straight, and you don't go quiet just because quiet feels a little safer. Cassius looked at her a long time in the dark. I won't go quiet again, he said. Not for you. Not ever. It wasn't a small promise. Both of them understood this weight inside it, the 11 years it was measured against, and neither one of them tried to make the moment smaller than it was, by filling it with anything further. They sat there together on that porch, step a while longer, cold coming down harder, neither one moving to leave, until finally Magnolia stood, dusted off her skirts, and said in a voice that had gone almost light again, almost teasing, the way a person reaches for lightness after too much truth has been spent in one sitting. You're going to have to build me a bigger porch step, Cassius Colton. This one's about done for, and Cassius, despite everything, despite 11 years of grief sitting, cracked open on the ground between them, laughed. A real laugh. Short, surprised out of him, the first one in longer than he could easily count. I'll get right on that, he said. She rode home through the cold dark with something new sitting in her chest, something that wasn't quite happiness yet, but was standing very close to where happiness usually lived. And Cassius stood on his porch a long while after her horse's hoofbeats had faded, looking out at the black shape of the ridge, feeling, for the first time in 11 years, like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd been carrying so long, he'd forgotten it was a choice. He did not know yet that Garrity's patience was running out. He did not know that a bottle of carbolic and 3-cut wire are only the opening moves of something considerably uglier still to come. Something that would arrive on the back of the season's first real blizzard and ask us more of both of them than fence posts or well water ever had. But that night, Walk went back inside his own quiet house. Cassius Colton did something he had not done in 11 years. He said her name out loud, not Winifred's. The living one, Magnolia, he said to the empty room, just to hear how it sat in his own mouth after everything. It sat there fine. It sat there like something intended to keep saying. For a good long while yet to come. The sky turned wrong on a Tuesday. Magnolia felt it before she saw it. A stillness in the air that had no business being still. Not this time of year. Not with the wind that never once let up on this valley since the day she'd arrived. She stood in the yard with a bucket in each hand and watched the light go the color of an old bruise along the western ridge. And something cold that had nothing to do with temperature moved straight down her spine, all her 6 spilus, palms. Because she'd read enough of Silas's letters to know exactly what that color meant. Because the herd was out in the near pasture, 40 head, and 40 head does not fit inside a barn built for 12. She dropped the buckets. She didn't look back at the house. She saddled her horse with hands that had gone fast and sure the way hands do when the thinking part of a person steps aside and lets the doing part take over, and she rode for the near pasture with the first hard gust already cutting sideways across the yard behind her. Cassius saw the same sky from his own orange for his thought before his own stock, before his own barn, before anything that was rightfully his to worry about first was her, alone out there. A woman alone, with a herd and a storm coming on, fast enough to swallow the sun whole. His heart went into his throat in a way that told him, plainer than any thinking ever could, exactly how far gone he already was. He didn't stop to reason it through. He didn't stop to weigh his own cattle against hers. He swung up and rode, hard into a wind that was already trying to take the hat off his head, praying, actually praying. words moving in his chest that he hadn't used since he was a boy. He'd find Rosita safe inside four walls. He did not find her inside four walls. He came up over the last rise with snow already driving sideways, thick enough to blur the world to gray and white, and the black shapes of cattle bunched and bawling in confusion. And there, right in the middle of it, ducks unmistakable even through the whiteout, because nothing else on God's earth was built like her was Magnolia, on her horse, working the herd toward the draw alone, doing it exactly right. The way somebody does a thing they've studied and understood, down to a little bone. His fear turned, in that one instant, into something else entirely. Pride, fierce and startled and entirely unashamed of itself. He rode in beside her, without a word wasted on greeting. There wasn't time for words. There was only the storm and the herd, and the two of them working it together, shouting over a wind that ate half of every sentence before it landed, pushing 40 head of frightened. A draw, where the snow couldn't pile, and the wind couldn't reach. It took the better part of 2 hours. It felt like 10. By the time the last cow was down in the draw and settled, both of them were soaked through and shaking. Snow crusted thick on eyelashes and collars, hands gone past feeling. They rode back to the Vance house, half blind in the driving white, and Cassius had got the door open and got Magnolia inside and got a fire roaring in the stove, before either one of them had said a single word about what had just happened. They sat by that fire while the storm screamed against the walls outside, both of them shaking, and something had changed in the way they looked at each other. It changes, in that particular quiet way, when two people have shoulder to shoulder against something that could have killed either one of them, and come to the other side together. "You shouldn't have come out in that," Magnolia said finally, voice hoarse from shouting into wind. "Neither should you. They're my cattle, and you're—" Cassius stopped. Started again. "You're not just somebody I made a promise to look after anymore, Magnolia. I need you to hear that plain?" She looked at him across the firelight, wrapped in a blanket, hair plastered flat with melting snow, face chapped raw from the wind, and her breath caught, and she found she had no wish at all to look away from him. "I hear it," she said. Neither one of them said anything further. The fire popped, the wind screamed. And for a while that was enough, the two of them sitting close, warm at last after cold enough to kill, saying nothing, because nothing needed saying yet. The storm held for 2 full days. Cassius stayed. There was nowhere else to go, and no part of him wanted to try. He slept in Silas's old spare room, proper, respectful, and by day the two of them sat through the howling, white, and away neither of them had talked to another living soul in longer than either cared to count. She told him about the tent, about the Barker's voice, the quarter admission, and what it feels like that every single day of your life, by people before what we have decided, before you've spoken, exactly what you are. She told him about her parents, decent people who had simply run out of ideas for a daughter too large for the life they'd imagined for her, and how that wasn't cruelty exactly, just a kind of failure that hurt all the same. She told him, too, about Silas's letters, the mule that opened gates, the fool who tried to walk a wagon across frozen creek ice, and for the first time since the telegram had come announcing her uncle's death, she found herself laughing about him instead of only grieving him, and something in that felt like a small kind of healing she hadn't known she needed. Cassius understood the rest of it better than she expected, though he did not repeat the whole of what he'd already told her on his own porch step. Some truths only need saying once to be true forever. What he told her instead on the second evening, fire burning low, was something he had never said to another living soul. "There's a china cup," he said, "Winifred's. Only thing of hers I kept. Sits on a shelf in my kitchen where I see it every single morning, and I have never once let myself use it, not in 11 years, because using it felt like forgiving myself for something I hadn't earned forgiveness for yet." Magnolia said nothing. "Waited. I think I'm ready to use it now," Cassius said, "not to forget her. To stop punishing myself in her name instead of honoring her properly. There's a difference. Took me 11 years to learn it. What changed? You did." He looked at her steady. watching you refuse to shrink for anybody. It made the shape of my own cowardice a lot harder to look away from. And when this storm breaks, and it will break, what? I mean to go into that town and say the whole truth out loud in front of whoever's listening. Not for absolution, because it's owed. 11 years overdue, Magnolia reached across the space between them and took his hand, her hand swallowing his whole, the way it did with most things. And neither one of them found anything funny in that just then, only something steady and warm and entirely new. Then we'll see what that costs, she said. Together, Cassius held onto that word longer than he let on. Together 11 years, he had carried everything alone, on purpose, as a kind of penance. He was starting to understand that penance and love were not the same thing, and that a man could set one down without betraying the other. They talked past midnight, that second night, the fire down to embers, and somewhere in the small hours, the wind outside began, very slowly, to ease, not stopping, not yet, but losing the raw, furious edge it had carried for 2 straight days. Neither of them noticed exactly when it happened. They were too busy noticing each other. The storm broke on the 3rd morning, and the world it left behind was white and silent and, underneath the silence, considerably more dangerous than either of them yet understood. Because Cornelius Garrity had spent those 2 blizzard days doing exactly what a man like Garrity does. When a storm hands him cover, he didn't have to create himself. He'd sent 3 hired men out. Under cover of the whiteout, and while the whole valley huddled indoors waiting for weather no sane person would move cattle through, those 3 men had drifted a good portion of Magnolia's herd, the very cattle she and Cassius had bled 2 hours of their lives, saving off toward Garrity's own land, driving them slow and careful through drifts deep enough to hide tracks, counting on the blizzard to erase whatever evidence a decent man might have found. It was, Garrity figured, a clean piece of work. Cattle lost in a storm was the oldest excuse in the territory. Nobody would look twice. He had not counted Magnolia Vance, riding her fence line at first light, the very morning the storm broke, the way she'd done every single morning since the fence started getting cut. Because she had stopped trusting anything to explain itself without her checking first. She found the drag marks in the fresh snow before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Not drift marks. Drift is scattered, confused cattle moving every direction at once, trying to find shelter. These were straight, deliberate, driven. She followed them. She found the 3 men a mile past her own fence line, pushing the last dozen of her herd across a frozen creek bed toward Garrity land, and she did not think about what came next. She simply put her horse into a dead run across snow deep enough to swallow a smaller mount to the belly, and she came up on those 3 men like weather arriving. That's my stock. The lead rider, a lean, hard-faced man she'd never seen before, turned in his saddle and looked at her. The way you'd look at something you'd been told to expect, and still weren't fully prepared for. Storm scattered 'em, he said. We're just moving strays back toward shelter, ma'am. Happy to hand 'em over to their rightful owner. Whoever that turns out to be, I am their rightful owner. And strays don't get driven in straight lines hard toward a fence that isn't mine. Careful now, his hand had drifted slow, toward the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Big woman or not, you're outnumbered 3 to 1 out here, and nobody's gonna. He never finished that sentence, because at exactly that moment, a small, panicked shape came stumbling out from behind a drift no more than 30 yards off a boy, 8 or 9 years old, half frozen, sobbing, having plainly wandered off from somewhere, and gotten himself turned around in the last hours of the storm, and directly behind him, swept across broken ice. The Crozon Creek groaned under weight and gave. The ice cracked. The boy went down into black, freezing water up to his chest, screaming, arms flailing, current dragging at him even in that shallow, half-frozen creek with a strength that could kill a child in minutes. Magnolia did not hesitate. For 1/2 of 1 second, she was off her horse and into that water, before the 3 riders had even fully registered what was happening, breaking ice with her own bare hands to reach him, and she hauled that boy out of the freezing creek in one motion. wrapped him against her own body for warmth, and had him up on solid ground and stripped of his soaked outer clothes into her own coat. Before the lead writer had managed to say a single word, "Somebody ride for his people," she said, voice sharp as a whip crack, entirely unbothered by the cold water soaking her through to the bone. Now, he's got minutes, not hours. And here is the thing about a moment like that. Here is the thing that changes everything underneath it. Because the three riders, hard men, paid men who'd come out that morning to steal cattle under cover of a lie, stood there and watched a woman the whole valley had been whispering about pull a freezing child out of dying water with her bare hands. Faster and surer than any of them could have managed, and something in even the hardest of them could not quite look away from that. The lead rider lowered his hand from the rifle scabbard. Slow. Like it had suddenly occurred to him what kind of man he'd be if he didn't. "Ride," Magnolia said again, and this time he rode. Cassius arrived 20 minutes later, having heard the commotion from the ridge and come at a dead run, and he found the strangest scene of his entire life waiting for him. 3 of Garrity's hired men, cattle forgotten and drifting loose behind them, helping Magnolia wrap a half-frozen boy in every warm thing they owned between them. All animosity burned clean out of the moment by something plainer and older than any of their small schemes. "What happened?" Cassius said, breathless. "Garrity's men were driving my herd off," Magnolia said, "and there was a boy in the creek. That's what matters right now. Cattle can wait." The boy turned out to be the miller's youngest, wandered off during the storm. He's chasing a lost dog 3 miles from a Deb laid. Quietly, permanently at nobody's door, but bad luck. Word of it reached town before sundown. It always does. And this was the moment the whole shape of the valley's opinion began slowly to turn, because a story about a big strange woman poisoning her own well is one kind of story. It travels fast and ugly and asks nothing of the people who repeat it. But a story about that same woman pulling a drowning child out of black, freezing water with her bare hands, faster than 3 grown men could manage between them. That is a different kind of story entirely, and it does not travel quietly. It travels loud, and it asks something of everyone who hears it, whether they want to answer or not. By the next morning, half the town had heard it 3 different ways, and every version ended the same place. She saved him. With her own hands, Cornelius Garrity heard it too, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man watching a plan die in real time, that he had lost considerably more than a dozen head of cattle that morning. He tried one more move. It was, in the end, his last. He rode into town that evening and called for a meeting. At the church hall, the old excuse dusted off and given new urgency. Safety, he said. The safety of this community. A creature that size living unregulated among decent families, and wasn't it time the town council looked at whether such a person ought to be permitted to hold land at all? He had not counted on Cassius Colton. Walking through that door before he'd finished his second sentence, Cassius stood in the aisle of that packed church hall, hat in hand, and every eye in the room turned to him. And for one long, terrible second, the old 11-year silence rose up in him one final time, offering him the easy path, the quiet path, the path he'd walked his whole adult life. He did not take it. "I've got something to say," Cassius said, and his voice carried to the back wall without him raising it above a normal pitch, because a room goes quiet fast when it senses a true thing is about to be said in it. And I should have said something like it 11 years ago in this very hall, about a different woman. I didn't. That silence cost my wife her life, near enough, and it's cost me every day since. I am not making that mistake twice. He looked around the room, found faces he'd known his whole life, made himself hold their eyes instead of the floor. "Cornelius Garrity has been cutting Magnolia Vance's fence and fouling her well for weeks," he said. "I've got the bottle of carbolic to prove the second part, and a boot print that matches one of his hired hands to prove the first. He did it because he wants her water rights and he can't buy them honest. So he's been trying to make her too much trouble to keep, and he's been feeding this town rumors soft enough to swallow when trouble showed up. You'll blame her for it instead of him. murmurs. Geraghty's face had gone the color of old ash. And 2 days back, Cassius went on while the rest of us sat warm indoors. Through that storm, his men drove a dozen head of her cattle off her land under cover of the blizzard. She caught them at it, and in the middle of catching them, she pulled the miller's boy out of freezing creek water with her bare hands and saved his life, faster than 3 grown men standing right there could manage between them. He let that sit a moment. I don't know what you all decide to do about the water rights or the council or any of the rest of it, Cassius said. But I know what I'm not doing anymore, which is standing quiet in a room while somebody I love gets talked about like she's not a person. I did that once. I buried the woman I did it to. I am done doing it. The room was silent enough to hear the stove ticking. Somewhere near the back home, the miller stood up. A quiet man, not given to speeches, and he cleared his throat and said, "Simple as anything, my boy's alive because of her." That's all I need to know about what kind of person she is. One of the 3 hired riders, the lean, hard-faced man from the creek, stood up too, hat twisting in his hands, plainly uncomfortable to be speaking in front of a church full of decent people. "I'll say this much," he said. "Geraghty paid us to move her cattle off in the storm and call it drift. Wasn't drift, and I've seen a lot of things in this line of work I'm not proud of. Never seen a woman go into freezing creek water after a boy that wasn't hers to save, not stopping to think twice about it. Whatever she is. That's not nothing. Not everyone in that room changed their mind that night. Some people don't, no matter what proof you set in front of them, no matter how plain a truth gets spoken. There were faces that stayed closed, arms that stayed crossed, and Magnolia would learn, in the months that followed, that a few of those faces never fully opened. That was simply true, and she made her peace with it the way she'd made peace with harder things before. But the council vote on Geraghty's proposal died that same night, quiet without even needing a formal count, because a room that has just heard about a drowning child pulled from black water has no appetite left for arguing about who deserves to own land. And within the month, word came that Geraghty had sold off his overgrazed acres and moved on to try his schemes in some other valley that hadn't yet learned to see through him. Magnolia Vance stood at the woodpile a cold morning the following spring. Not quite a year since Cassius Colton had first ridden over to tell her a ranch was no place for a city girl. She set a round of pine up on end, split it clean, set up another. The valley had changed around her in small ways that winter had left behind. The miller's boy, fully recovered, had taken to waving at her from the mercantile whenever she rode past, wide-eyed and unashamed of it now. The old woman with the sharp eyes had taken to nodding at her in the street. So small thing. But Magnolia had learned by now to notice small things. Not every door had opened, but enough had, and she found she no longer needed all of them. To Cassius came up the drive slow, the way he always did now, unhurried, no excuse needed anymore for the visit. "I've got something to say," he said, echoing without meaning to the words he'd spoken in the court hall. And Magnolia set her axe down and turned to face him, because something in his voice told her this was not a small thing. "I owe you an apology first," Cassius said, "for that first morning. I looked at you and decided who you were before you'd said a word, and I was wrong about every part of it, top to bottom. You are the strongest person I have ever known. And I don't mean your arms, though Lord knows. I mean the rest of you. The part that outlasted a tent and a barker's voice, and 9 years of being looked at instead of seen, and came out the other side still soft enough to pull a drowning child out of freezing water without a second's hesitation. Cassius, let me finish. I've waited 11 years to say a true thing out loud in front of people who needed to hear it, and I'm not much better at waiting a few minutes more, so let me finish. He took a breath. I am not asking you to be saved. You've shown me plain, over and over, that you never needed saving from anything this valley could throw at you. I'm asking if you'll share it with me instead. This land, this life, whatever's left of my heart after 11 years of too scared to use it right. Will you have me, Magnolia? Magnolia Vance stood there in the cold morning light, axe resting against the chopping block, and she thought of a girl of 19 stepped into a tent for the first time, and a woman of 28 stepping the train into a town that had never seen anything like her and never would again. I'll have you, she said. On one condition, name it. This is 2 ranches joined, not one ranch with a wife add-on. My land stays mine. Yours stays yours. And we work them together, side by side. 2 people who both know how to set a post and split a round of wood without needing the other one's permission first. Can you live with a wife built like that? Cassius laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded. The kind that comes out of a man only when 11 years of wait has finally, truly set itself down. Magnolia, he said, a wife like that is the only kind I'd ever want. I just didn't know she existed until I watched her split her 3rd round of pine without looking up at me. They married that spring in the same church hall where Cassius had finally found his voice. The miller's boy stood at the front of the small crowd, scrubbed and solemn in his Sunday clothes, and when the vows were said, he was the first one on his feet, clapping. Not everyone in the valley came, but more came than either of them had expected. And Cassius understood, watching the room, that a town's opinion of a person was never really one single thing. It was 100 small opinions, changing one at a time, at their own pace, some faster than others, some not changing at all. The woodpile stayed exactly where it had always stood, because Magnolia never did stop splitting her own wood. Long after there were hired hands, enough to do it for her 10 times over. She was fond of it for what it had started, and fonder still of what it had ended. Years on, a young ranch hand new to the valley once offered, kindly enough, to spare the lady of the house the trouble of the axe. Cassius, passing by, only said, "I wouldn't, son. I told her once a ranch was no place for a city girl. She spent every day since proving me wrong, and I have never in my life enjoyed being wrong so much." And Magnolia, not looking up, smiled the same small, patient smile she'd worn that very first cold morning, and set up another round and split it clean.